It is a very good question. I think this also speaks to why it can be very tough to diagnose ADHD, particularly because one of the things that I learned, as well as one of the ways that I think about the work that I do, is that in ADHD, comorbidity or the existence of two diagnoses at the same time is the rule, not the exception. I say that because ADHD can actually look very different person to person, not only according to gender or sex or racial ethnic identity, right? All the different identity pieces that we're going to get into later on, but also just in terms of how we are coping with our symptoms, how our symptoms look like on the outside, right? People perceiving us can very much be impacted in that way.
Welcome to Leadership Rewired. Allison Allen and Dean Martin invite you to join them for an honest conversation that brings a personal perspective to the issues of leadership.
Welcome to the Leadership Rewired podcast. I'm Dean Martin, and with me is my co-host, Allison Allen. You're joining us today for the third in a series called Leading Minds, which is about harnessing the power of the mind for exceptional leadership. And each of our episodes is exploring a specific facet of how our brain works, leadership brain science. We want to give you just enough to help you to adapt your approach as a leader for better performance.
So hi, everyone. Allison, co-host here. I am super excited about this topic today. I can relate to the topic. I have family members. I've managed folks around the space. And there's so much to learn and so much that we need to know. Just to recap, the 3-part series, the first series was really about, self-assessments, 360s, evaluations that you can take for yourself, personally or professionally, and how you can leverage those to actually grow your career, especially today when there's so much change happening going on. You need to understand where you are and where you need to get to in order to lead your people. The second was really about this notion of leading with calm and stress and how to manage stress and how stress may show up in your body and, in essence, how that may impact your team and yourself. And more than that, how to recognize sort of stress within your team. And then, as Dean mentioned, this particular topic, it's about leadership and ADHD, understanding and managing and thriving. And in a situation where you have this in leadership roles.
So we've got a wonderful guest today. We're joined by Dr. Chiara Manosalvas. Chiara, so lovely to have you here. Let me tell folks a little bit about you, and then I'll, of course, invite you to share what's important for us to know about you at the top of this episode, and then we'll get to talk about ADHD, really appreciating your experience here and your expertise. So you're a licensed bilingual psychologist. You're based in New York City, specializing in trauma, anxiety, and also ADHD. And you've got individual, you've got couples, clients, you offer that kind of therapy. As well as ADHD diagnostic assessments for, particularly for women of color. So Chiara, thank you so much for being here. What else do you think you'd like to share with folks about who you are before we get going on this actual topic?
Sure. So I would say that the other thing that is also just important to know about me is that when I'm not doing clinical work, I'm also teaching. So I'm faculty at Teachers College at Columbia. It's also where I did my PhD, and I coordinate the bilingual Latinx. And I coordinate the bilingual Latinx mental health concentration, and so that's something that I love. I love working with students, and I very much integrate all of the clinical work, particularly around ADHD, in my teaching as well. And so I'm happy to talk more about that later on. But I'm excited to talk to all of you.
Yeah, indeed. We also, Chiara and I, the reason why I managed to connect with Chiara and said to Allison, I've got the perfect person for our conversation today, is that I know you, Chiara, through our connection with another organization called Steel Advising, where we are each advisors. That's an organization, not sponsors of this podcast, but how we came to know one another. An organization that pairs neurodivergent adults with specialist advisors to support them in their, to enhance their executive functioning and strengthening their skills. So today, let's talk about what is ADHD in adults, How does it impact the way we lead? And then, as always, we like to make sure there's some really practical elements here. What tips or practical things can we give to leaders who may have ADHD, or maybe they're undiagnosed, but they suspect? You're listening and you go, yeah, I think I probably have it. Practical tips for you to flourish with this. And then as a leader, what are some actions that you can take to create a far more inclusive environment, particularly for those who may have some kind of neurodiversity? How can you create that environment in your team? So those are our 4 big things that we're going to be talking about today. Kiara, do you want to just get us going with what is ADHD? What's a good way for us to understand this?
Sure. So ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a neurodevelopmental condition, which essentially means that people with ADHD, we see changes in the structure of the brain, how the brain works, how different parts of the brain respond to one another. And it is a diagnosis in the DSM. And something that's just important to keep in mind is that there are 3 different types. So there's ADHD predominantly inattentive, ADHD predominantly hyperactive, and ADHD combined, where we see both. Something that's also important to keep in mind with adults, particularly since those are the folks that, is the kind of the target audience in this for this podcast, and those in leadership or those working with leaders, is that in adults we tend to see mostly predominantly inattentive
Right.
characteristics in ADHD. And so that's just something that's helpful to keep in mind as we start to think about some of the different strategies for working with folks who are neurodivergent.
Right. And what would you say, how does this actually show up, or how would an adult perhaps become aware of the fact that they have ADHD? Maybe they weren't diagnosed as a child, but what are some of the signs that people could be looking for in themselves?
Right. So it is a very good question. I think this also speaks to why it can be very tough to diagnose ADHD, particularly because one of the things that I learned, as well as one of the ways that I think about the work that I do, is that in ADHD, comorbidity, or the existence of 2 different diagnoses, the existence of 2 diagnoses at the same time is the rule, not the exception. So I say that because ADHD can actually look very different person to person, not only according to gender or sex or racial ethnic identity, right? All the different identity pieces that we're going to get into later on, but also just in terms of how we are coping with our symptoms, how our symptoms look like on the outside, right? People perceiving us can very much be impacted in that way. And so different ways that it can show up is that ADHD is a condition where people tend to struggle with focus, impulsivity, and emotion regulation. And something that I love working with something that I really love doing is really helping women particularly understand, given that we're seeing a lot of late diagnosed women diagnosed with ADHD, and seeing how emotion regulation, or the ability to control, or the ability to balance out how you're feeling, can become dysregulated with an ADHD diagnosis. However, that's more complicated by things like anxiety or depression or PTSD or other things that a person may be presenting with. And so we tend to see, particularly in women, we see a lot of internalized symptoms. So we see a lot of negative self-talk. So yes, we see issues with organization and time management. However, in my work, what I do is, yes, we're going to teach you the skills. We're going to teach you the strategies that help you understand or that help you learn executive functioning skills, right? So the issues around organization, time management, planning, but also what are some of the mindset changes that need to happen? Some of the thoughts that you're having about yourself, about the work that you do, that contribute to your symptoms. And so that's where my work gets more interesting personally, because it's not just about teaching someone to use a calendar, or teaching someone to use a calendar, or teaching someone how to be consistent in a particular strategy that they're using. It's actually more so about helping them realize what are the blocks that they have up that are preventing them from doing the things that they know how to do, or perhaps have gotten exposed to, but self-defeating, limiting beliefs are preventing them from actually using those skills.
So without getting too political, what would you say? You mentioned, late diagnosis for women. What would you say is behind
that?
I would say, why is that?
I would say that I I believe that the personal is political, that the professional can very much be political, particularly as a psychologist. I'm not just working with people's symptoms in a vacuum, right? So if a woman or a person of color or someone from the LGBTQ community comes to me and is explaining to me how they're having trouble with focus, they're not being able to concentrate, they're not being able to sit down and get things done, while I'm certainly considering how an ADHD diagnosis might be impacting the presenting concern or the reason why the person is seeking out support, whether it's therapy or coaching or whatever, I'm also thinking about how if we have an administration that is actively jeopardizing and compromising the lives of folks who are in my office, right? Of course, you're going to have focus problems. Of course, you're going to feel issues with motivation and concentration. And that doesn't take away from the very real reality that people experience, particularly because we know ADHD is neurodevelopmental, right? We know it's related to changes in the brain, but we also just can't discount the very real, we can't dismiss the very real intermingling of nature versus nurture. And here we see nurture, right? And our society and our culture very much influencing how people present with symptoms. And so,
I would imagine there's also some self sort of, issues with not issues, that's probably the wrong word, but just not wanting something to be named. Does that make sense?
I mean, I think one of the things that I come up across very often, particularly when I work with women of color, is one of the things that I love to ask folks when I'm working with them, again, whether it's therapy or coaching, is what makes them want to get support now, right? What made them reach out now? Because oftentimes people have been struggling for many months or years prior to making that appointment, but something happened, right? What was the camel that broke what was the straw that broke the camel's back? And I find that oftentimes a person will have a lot of insight into what exactly prompted them to actually get support in the first place. And that is really an opportunity for me to help that person recognize, you've had coping skills and strategies for your entire life, right? Like you have all of these innate skills that you certainly have utilized throughout the course of your life to make things work, right? Even if it's been challenging, right? How can we lean on your strengths? How can we lean on what's worked? And also then identify what hasn't worked, right? And so with anyone that I'm working with, I'm really being mindful of the fact that coping strategies can range in so many different ways. And so how do we then get really clear on what's currently not working so that we can help you identify some new options?
Right, yeah. Kiara, would you also say that for an ADHD diagnosis, we could look back and typically see a pattern of these sorts of things occurring? I'm thinking about people who, listening to this and say, I have problems with memory, or, I'm impulsive emotionally or whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean you have ADHD. Like, what else needs to be present? Is it like a recurring pattern or something that's been fairly enduring for a number of years?
Yes. So according to the DSM, the diagnostic criteria requires that for a person to be diagnosed with ADHD, the symptoms have to be present prior to age 12. So that's the big diagnostic criteria in being able to get diagnosed with ADHD. However, we're seeing a lot of people, I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing, because very similar, Allison, to what you were saying, right? I think that there's a lot of validation in getting a diagnosis if that's the person's reaction to it. However, what we're seeing a lot of is people diagnosed with ADHD after a 15-minute appointment with a psychiatrist. They fill out a self-report form and, they fill out that they can't concentrate, that they can't focus, that they're having trouble with their emotions or controlling their emotions. And the psychiatrist or the doctor, whoever, just someone who doesn't have experience working with ADHD, takes those numbers, right, that assessment measure, that score, and translates that to mean this person meets criteria for ADHD. But it's often much more complicated than that, because we have to go back into a person's childhood. We have to be able to understand what they were like as a child, in school, with family, in different contexts. And the symptoms also have to be present in at least 2 contexts. So it can't only be at home. We have to see symptoms showing up before the age of 12, as well as at work, at school, at work, at school, at the person's home environment. And so that's just something important to keep in mind in terms of the trajectory.
Right. Okay.
So on that though, because you said something pretty interesting there, going back to your point earlier about coping mechanisms, right? And a lot of us learn coping mechanisms when we were our children. So to have someone be diagnosed before 12, it's like, how would they, I'm guessing you don't have, I know this will take forever, but it's like, there must be ways in which you can get at that before 12 picture that tells you whether or not someone has symptoms of ADHD. Can you give just a little light touch on that? What does that look like?
So just to clarify how I understand whether or not symptoms were present when they were children.
Yeah, because you said two things have to be true. Yeah. I think you said before 12 diagnosis, and you said exam or some indicators in both professional, personal, and other aspects of life.
Yes.
Is that fair?
And so I'll actually also kind of speak to this from a personal note. So I have ADHD. I was actually diagnosed. I'm about to be 32. I was actually diagnosed, I think, when I was 27. So it's been a couple years now. I was in the second year of my PhD program, and I got diagnosed the way that a lot of people are getting diagnosed, where I had been speaking to a psychiatrist, filled out that form, and got suggested that I try Adderall. I did end up trying it because I'd been struggling significantly. And while it helped me in ways that, I'm still making sense of, and it really has, of course there are side effects, but I find that the benefits it's brought me has just really changed my life. However, right, as someone who is also training to be a psychologist, as someone who has also seen folks with ADHD throughout my training, for myself, I had this really frustrating inner conflict of, is it ADHD? Is it anxiety? Is it depression? Is it a very real response to all of the chaos that's happening in the world and the marginalization that I was experiencing as a woman of color from working class, being at Columbia, and seeing a lot of lives that were not like mine and a lot of identities that were not like mine. And so, there was this balance of wanting to both honor my experiences and also really understand, is it ADHD? And so later on, what I ended up doing is I graduated, I got a job, I started making money because I wasn't a student for the first time in 10 years. And I actually decided to get a comprehensive ADHD diagnostic assessment, which had been recommended to me by several other colleagues that, had been exposed to this kind of work. And what I had learned, as well as what I now do in my practice, is in order to assess for symptoms in childhood, I will be speaking to collateral. So I'll be speaking to parents, I'll be speaking to siblings, I'll be speaking to folks who knew my client as a child, so caregivers. I'll be asking for report cards. And so this is how I was trained to be able to assess for symptoms, as well as what I experienced. Right. And I found that it was a very helpful model for me to recognize that I can assess for symptoms, even if a person isn't necessarily entirely sure of whether or not symptoms were present in childhood.
Right. That actually was a really cool answer. And no, seriously, because I got, when you started talking about taking the time, and I think that's so critical to find that person who's actually interested in really helping you uncover what your diagnosis is. Because you will find the person who will say, fill out this form and then let's talk about it, right? And I love this approach of really checking into all aspects of someone's childhood and having those conversations. How would someone, who is a leader, identify if they have ADHD, or even be curious to whether or not they should maybe talk to someone?
Yeah. I would say that some of the biggest issues that a person is experiencing might relate to organization. So feeling like no matter how much maybe perhaps you're taking too much on, you're having a hard time being able to recognize when you have too much on your plate. For a lot of people, actually, let me rewind. I also want to emphasize that most people in some shape or form at some point in their lives struggle with organization, struggle with time management, struggle with focus, right? These are not struggles that only people with ADHD experience. However, when a person with ADHD has these symptoms, these are chronic, right? So it's not just when they're overwhelmed that they are all of a sudden messy and can't, get to places on time. It's actually even when they're in a good mood or when they're in a bad mood, right? So it's not so much about whatever is going on in that particular moment. It's
right.
Developmentally, neurologically, we see changes and differences in how a person manages time. And so we may see a person also having a really tough time with emotion regulation. So maybe they're responding to situations in a way that they recognize as perhaps disproportional to what's going on, but they're not necessarily able to actually cope and calm down in a way that is appropriate for the situation. But again, I think that there's a balance of the time management, executive functioning skills that a person tends to struggle with, while also being mindful of the thoughts and the behaviors and the emotions that could make symptoms worse for people.
Yeah. And that's certainly something, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, Kiara, but that's also something I see in some of the clients that I work with, or just understanding ADHD or even how my own brain works, is that there's some observable ways in which people are operating that might be an indicator. I'm struggling to focus, or I'm terrible at completing tasks, or I get overwhelmed when I have too many options, or I'm struggling to manage my emotions. If I'm feeling overwhelmed by something, I'll just ignore it, that kind of thing, externally observed. But there's also that subjective experience that comes along with it, which also exacerbates that, which is, why is this so hard for me? Why can't I just sit down and finish this? Why can't I just begin this task? Why can't I just do this? Other people can do this. Why is it so hard for me? And that self-talk you spoke earlier about, that mindset, I can see how that's so valuable to explore with people, that it's not just, here I am, a leader with ADHD, and sometimes, people are observing this stuff of me. But what does it feel like for me? I'm feeling overwhelmed and frustrated and annoyed and ashamed that apparently I can't do these things, but other people can.
Right. And, it's interesting because right now in my coaching work, I tend to do a lot of ADHD coaching. And right now I'm working with a lot of lawyers. And what I find so interesting is, these attorneys are individuals that have gone to some of the best law schools, Harvard Law, Columbia. They're very accomplished, right? And they worked very, very hard. But their law firm, for whatever reason, whatever struggles they were having, connected them to me, right? Because of the incentive in making sure that these folks are taken care of and making sure that they receive services to support the diagnosis. The law firm will often hire me to be able to give sessions to these individuals. And what I hear all the time, right, is that a person has this incredible CV, this incredible resume, but inside they either feel like they don't deserve it. The imposter syndrome is very often there, right? This feeling that I don't deserve what I accomplished. And there's also this sense of, even if I do get things done, I am still feeling this constant tug of war between my potential, what I could do, and all the obstacles that are in the way, right? So it's almost like you're never satisfied with what you have accomplished because you are constantly just beating yourself up and telling you that other people are better, or other people don't need the skills that you do, when really that only hurts you. And so, I think that there's a lot to be explored there in regards to just how a person makes sense of what they're struggling with, particularly at work.
Yeah. I would love us to look at some practical tips for leaders who have ADHD, or whether they're diagnosed or not. And in particular, also look at what are the benefits, or what's the uniqueness or the gifts associated with ADHD? What can this sort of way of thinking and operating offer as an unexpected benefit within a work environment? So what can leaders do with ADHD, Kiara?
Sure. So one of the big things that I always tell people is that there is a very real Something that I often tell clients is that person-environment person environment fit makes a huge difference. And so oftentimes I am working with folks who like what they're doing, but either the culture of the workplace or how they receive rules or how they receive feedback isn't aligning with the way that inspires them, that motivates them, that drives them to succeed. And so I encourage my clients to get really clear on what do you need at work, right? What do you need in the office, on your team to be able to feel supported? And so oftentimes what I'm doing with clients and what I then encourage companies and organizations to do is to get really clear on a person's strengths. So if we can do any sort of character strengths assessment, so that's something that I often do with a lot of my clients. Something that I often refer to when I'm working with clients is this idea of helping them develop and identify their zone of genius. This isn't a term that I created. It's something I read somewhere. But we all have our zone of genius. Oftentimes we're being asked to operate outside of our zone of genius, which makes sense, right? We often have to kind of be multifaceted in terms of being able to get work done. But how do you not let the experiences where you're working outside of your zone of genius, where maybe you are not as strong in, impact your competence and your self-efficacy in the things that you are really good at? Because what I often see is that people get really hung up and get really self-critical on the things that they don't do well, that it then impacts the things that they do well and that they do enjoy. And so I tell people to really emphasize strengths, to really figure out what systems and what support systems are necessary to feel like not only you have a better understanding of what you need to thrive, but also do your leaders, does your boss, does your work team understand what you need to thrive, so that your strengths are complemented rather than made to feel like they're a deficit in some way.
Yeah.
What if anything should you do if you suspect that somebody on your team has? I think I know what you're going to say. At least I hope we're on the same page. But I'm curious. What would you suggest to leaders if they suspect that there's somebody on their team who has ADHD?
It's a really good question. So I would say that if you suspect there's someone on your team with ADHD, so this is actually something I see a lot in my work as a professor, because I see a lot of students who some do have ADHD and some don't. And so it's not, particularly as their professor, right? It's not my job to tell them whether or not they have ADHD. If I were their therapist, yes, but I have to know my boundaries. I have to know my lane. And in this role, right, it's not my responsibility, nor is it appropriate for me to diagnose someone with ADHD. Right. However, right, I am noticing that maybe a person is struggling with deadlines, or a person is struggling with, keeping up with the material. And so what I will do is, in a very non-judgmental, more affirming type of way, I'll ask to just check in with a person, and I'll say, this is something that I do with everyone on the team, and I would actually mean it, right? I do actually check in with my advisees, for instance. And I then use that opportunity not to shame them for maybe an area that I find themselves struggling in. But I say, hey, I just want to check in. I noticed that maybe you have this assignment overdue, or you're struggling to keep up with the readings, right? Or whatever it is that they're naming that they're struggling with. And I brainstorm with them, right? I don't tell them what to do, because I find that isn't helpful, right? There are so many strategies, there are so many skills, and 90% of them won't work for you, right? So you have to find the 10% that do. And it's not my job to tell my students or people on my team, use this, system because it works for me, so it's going to work for you. Instead, I see myself as a collaborator in helping the person recognize how their self-defeating thoughts, how their ideas about their competence and their ability to do well is impacting their ability to even get creative in finding ways of dealing with their solutions. So that's how I would do it. But again, it's just my style.
I actually think that's an appropriate answer. I think that's a very appropriate answer, even for corporate America and how you're working with your people. Sorry, Dean, you were going to say something?
No, well, Alison, what it reminded me of is in some earlier podcasts, Kiara, we've been speaking about psychological safety. Mm-hmm. So what does a leader do to create an environment where people feel they can be their best and they will not be punished or suffer some negative repercussion as a result of what they're doing or saying? Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about you and your advisee, I'm thinking to myself a couple of things. Firstly, whether somebody has ADHD or not, but particularly if they have, and let's say it's undiagnosed, I bet you anything, they know there's an area that they are working in that they're not comfortable in, and that they've had to really work hard at almost covering or getting those skills up to speed on. So they already know, oh, my manager's going to talk to me about my organization. My manager's always going to come to me because I know he's following up because I tend to not close the loop on things or whatever it is. So if you are a leader and you really are wanting to get the best out of your people and keep them in that zone of genius, then the sort of conversation that you've described to us here, Kiara, will only really happen if already as a leader you have created this psychological safety where you could even say to someone in your team, I've noticed that actually you get a hell of a lot of stuff done, but it takes a very long time in our first week for me to see your initial thoughts. Or that's just an example. Would it be helpful if maybe I gave you a structure of 5 big chunks of work for you to do? Can we work together in that way? You don't have to label it anything. You don't have to say, oh, I think you have ADHD. Or you can say, I've noticed you're amazing at A, B, and C, but actually, wow, I'm not seeing you close the loop, or I'm always chasing you for this sort of thing. How can I help you do that?
Yeah.
Then it's more likely that person's going to say, yes, that will actually be helpful. Can we put on a little meeting at the end of a Thursday so that you can ask me that thing? It's just going to help hold me accountable, but I don't feel like I'm being penalized or punished, or my manager's really on my case about it in a punitive way, but rather in a supportive way.
Right. 100%. There needs to be rapport, right? There needs to be a relationship. And I think that's, one of the core elements of my work as a psychologist is all of this. I'm trained in so many different approaches to therapy and strategies and different ways of working with different presenting concerns. But at the end of the day, while all those skills and strategies and approaches are helpful, very much like the things that I do with ADHD, it is the relationship that I build with people that allow them to actually be honest with me about that really critical self-voice that they have inside their head, that they will only feel comfortable telling me and disclosing to me if we've created that psychological safety, right? And it doesn't have to be, right, like a therapy level type of disclosure, right? A person doesn't have to feel unsafe as they're talking about these things or shouldn't feel unsafe. But I think that there is a way to create that rapport, create that sense of safety, create that sense of, like you're saying, Dean, right? Not making a person feel like they're being punished, but instead, hey, I'm just checking in. I know you do really good work in this domain. How can I support you so that translates to maybe an area that you don't have as much experience in? And so, really normalizing that it's a major relational goal in working with different folks.
Well, I was going to say, I think if a leader if that psychological safety is there, I really think then leaders who are listening, you will have established that based on what the response is of your person, because we all actually want some kind of support and help. And if you have ADHD, diagnosed or not, and you're in a team and oh crap, I'm always bad at this, or I'm beating myself up about these things, and somebody lovingly says, hey, you're outstanding in these areas, and in this one particular area, can I give you some ideas, or would you like some support, or how about we put a structure, or how about this? I think most people would say, thank you, yes. It doesn't feel nice, but I know it's going to help me. Yes, hold me to account here in this way, or give me a head start on something, or suggest something that's going to jog my memory around these particular things, whatever that issue is that somebody really needs extra support on. They'll take your offer. They'll take your offer and say, thank you, yes. Then I can still get on and just do beautiful work in this organization rather than have to hide and spend so much time almost covering and protecting others from seeing what you feel is a weakness or a deficiency, when it's actually just, okay, it's a different way in which your brain is working, and it's going to require a different kind of appreciation, self-appreciation, and structure for you to be able to get the most out of that.
Yep.
I think as we move toward like closing thoughts and key takeaways, I think my key takeaway from listening to the both of you in the last sort of 5 minutes is that we're not asking leaders to diagnose. We're not asking leaders to assess. We're actually asking leaders to just show up authentically with people, to notice where people are having a hard time, or if they're having a hard time, they could be having a great time, just notice, and figure out a way to sort of step back, sit down with that person on some kind of regular basis and share observations, share feedback, and then figure out ways to partner with that person to get the best out of them, because all people want to do is do the best they can. We want to do that as a leader, whether we have ADHD, or we want to build a team, whether they have ADHD or not. That's most successful. That's my big takeaway. Kiara, you?
I would say my big takeaway is to, I completely agree, Allison. I think that there is so much value in authenticity, and also reminding people that it's okay if that takes time to build, right? Like very much in therapy, I don't expect people to just trust me because I'm their therapist. It takes work from both of us, right, to be able to build that psychological safety. And it will differ with different people, right? So, and I think it requires people to get creative in regards to how we support one another. And so, I find that if I think about it like that, it helps me feel more optimistic about the work that I'm doing, rather than feeling burdened about all the different ways that I need to support individual members on my team. Because that can feel like a lot of work, right? To the idea of like individually catering your leadership style to each individual person.
Right.
Instead of thinking of it like that, I like to think of it, like as I get to know people, it'll feel a lot more automatic or instinctual for me to meet them where they're at, just based off of the training skills that leader has. So
yeah. Thank you,
Dean.
Yeah, I think my closing thoughts around this would be, we've discussed what some of the challenges are associated with ADHD, and also the gifts, the beautiful uniqueness that comes with neurodiversity. And I really hope this doesn't sound glib, but in a way, I would say if you have ADHD as a leader, or whether you are thinking about people in your team who have some type of neurodiversity suspected as ADHD, I think that's actually an incredible positive, because it means that you have scrutinized, assessed, paid attention to how you think, how you work, how you're processing your feelings and emotions, how you're getting your work done. It means you're far more awake and aware of it. And I think that's much of what we talk about, Alison and I, is about get to know yourself. How are you going to get into your zone of genius if you haven't understood that about yourself? So whilst it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, you may have ADHD. Thank goodness, because that means you already have a sense of, I know I'm amazing at this, and this comes easily, and that's beautiful, and these things are tough for me. That allows you really to step forward very intentionally around, how do I stay in my zone of genius? How do I get other support or strategies or skills that will help me to mitigate some of the things that are hard? Similarly, you got somebody in your team who might have this, whether you don't have to diagnose them, but how beautiful that there is somebody who has that awareness about themselves. That is a big first step in being able to really flourish and become successful and being able to contribute great stuff to a team. So thank goodness. I would say thank goodness for ADHD. And again, I want to say I'm not being glib or sort of trite in this, but I'm sure there are some people who just trot their way through life who've never even thought about how do they think. You've never even thought about it. How do I operate? This kind of diagnosis really, demands of us some paying attention to, and we can really harness that and bring about great things as a leader with this, because of it even.
Absolutely.
So beautifully said. So for our listeners, remember that the key to exceptional leadership lies not into conforming to a single idea, but embracing unique strengths that we all have and understanding really how your specific brain works and what makes you jive and successful. Kira, before we sign off, like where can people find you? How do people get in touch with you?
So I will quickly plug my new YouTube channel where I talk about mental health. I will be talking about leadership.
I love this name, by the way.
So my YouTube is In Session with Dr. Chiara.
Yes.
And I would love for anyone to follow me on there and subscribe. You can also find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, Dr. Chiara Monosalvas. And you're always welcome to email me, and I'm sure the email will be in the show notes. But I appreciate your time and I appreciate all the work that you all are doing to really help different leaders and different organizations embrace neurodiversity and recognize that ADHD is not a limitation, but a strength. It's just a matter of now figuring out how do we actually make people believe that it's a strength rather than having it feel like it's just glib, right, Dean? Because a lot of people think the way that you do, but want to feel authentic when they say those things. And I think that's where this conversation is really important.
Yeah. Super. Thank you, Chiara. Alison, thanks so much to our listeners. Thank you. Bye-bye.